coming up for me as I think about our church and about myself and about the world, and one thing that keeps coming up as I'm praying is, and in 10 o'clock service we've talked about this a little bit, but the two most repeated commands in all of Scripture are do not be afraid and remember. Do not be afraid and remember. And these things keep coming up for me as I think about all the things that I'm afraid of, as I think about a lot of unknowns in the future, as I think about this church. I have to keep telling myself, and I feel like God continues to say to me, don't be afraid, remember. And if anything, I guess that's my encouragement today too, is don't be afraid, remember. Because there are a lot of things worth being afraid of, but we don't have to. I think it's our choice whether or not we give into that fear. And I think all of our fears are real, whether it's a fear of the future, fear of the coming school year, fear of our parents, fear of a new season of life in our church. Life is just crazy, and life is weird, and crap happens, and things that we don't expect to happens, and white supremacists are rallying in Charlottesville, and that's scary as heck, and those things are really not that far removed from what we see and experience both in this church and out there in our streets. There's a lot to be afraid of, and I find myself needing to hear from God, and I find myself hearing again and again, do not be afraid, and remember. Remember always feels like it's attached to that. To remember God's goodness, and to remember how God has already shown up in my life and in the life of our church, and to remember where we come from, to remember our families, and to remember where this church comes from, and kind of the soil it came up out of the time of exclusion and legalized violence, really, when our church was founded in 1880. So do not be afraid, remember, is the invitation, I think, for me and for all of us, to be honest with our fears and to be honest about the places that we have forgotten God's goodness and we've forgotten God's faithfulness. And because of that, we're afraid. We're afraid to take risks. We're afraid to change things up. We're afraid to take a stand against things that need to be taken a stand against. So, and in the passage that I want to share with us today, those themes come up as well. And so this is something a passage that has also been on my mind a lot the past few months, and it's 2 Timothy chapter 1. It's up there. I'm going to read verse 3 to 7. There is verse 5 to 7. Right? So I'm going to read verse 3 to 7, and then you'll see 5 to 7 up there. So this is 2 Timothy chapter 1. I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I might be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-discipline. This is the word of the Lord. Really briefly, you can leave that up, yeah. Really briefly, I think I was reflecting on why Paul. So this is a letter from Paul to Timothy. Timothy is like really young. He's like 18 or something, I think, when he started his ministry with Paul. Paul's kind of a bigger deal at this point already in the Roman world. And he brings along this young guy, Timothy, and he writes him this letter. And I think it seems like a timely letter both for us and for Timothy, I imagine, because I think Timothy was also afraid. And Timothy was also in a time of transition. And the church, at this point in the church's life, in the early church, was also at a point of transition. So really briefly, Timothy Really briefly, Timothy is an interesting guy. So he's young. His dad is a Greek, and his mom is a Jew. His mom, Eunice, is a Jew. And Timothy was chosen to kind of come along in this new movement of Christians who are welcoming of Gentiles into the church. So I want to read you really quickly a few verses from Acts 16 where we introduce Timothy. So this is Acts 16, verse 1. Paul also came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. So really briefly, Paul freaking circumcised Timothy as a grown man, which sucks. And I think that, to me, really encapsulates the heaviness and the costliness of that call at that time. Because previously in Acts chapter 15, what we see is that the early church was in a lot of argument about, can we allow Gentiles, so non-Jewish people, into this new movement called Christianity without being circumcised and without adhering to the dietary laws. And they came to a decision, Paul and the disciples of Jesus came to a decision that yes, Gentiles can come and hang out with us and be a part of our church. They don't need to circumcise themselves. They don't need, they can eat pork, essentially what it came down to. But they can't eat meat that was sacrificed to idols, and we're holding them to a level of kind of sexual morality. And so that's kind of the decisions that they came to, is that yes, we want fellowship with non-Jewish people. That was a huge thing in the church, because up until that point, Christianity was only for Jews. It was like a Jewish sect. And up until that point, around Acts 15, it became a thing for everybody. And that changed their whole idea of who is in and who is out. And so Timothy gets brought along. Paul says Timothy, and Timothy was great because in his very body, he represented kind of a bridge between Jew and Gentile, because his father was a Greek, his mom was a Jew. In other words, Timothy is biracial and bicultural, and therefore he was a really great person to have. However, going into Jewish spaces, I don't know how they would know back then if you weren't circumcised. Maybe they had like bathhouses or something. But apparently people knew that he wasn't circumcised. I don't know, I won't ask questions there. But Timothy, at the age of however he was, as a teenager or as in the early 20s, Paul thought it was a good idea to circumcise him, even after they had come to this decision that Gentiles did not have to be circumcised in order to worship in God's house. To me, this brings up a lot of stuff. There's a lot, even in that passage in Acts 16, in terms of Timothy. There's the fact that he's biracial and bicultural. There's cultural stuff. There's ethnic stuff. There's the fact that Jews know about his dad, that he's a Greek, that people know about his family. So there's stuff about saving face. There's stuff about reputation. There's stuff about his body and incurring like violence or harm upon his body for the sake of other communities. There's all sorts of stuff there about Timothy, and we can't focus too much on that. All I want to focus on is Paul's encouragement to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1, where Paul is essentially saying, I know you might be scared, and I know we're entering into a new place as our church together. I know you're like 18. And yet, I remember the faith of your grandmother, Lois, and I remember the faith of your mom, Eunice. And that's your inheritance. And therefore, you don't have to be afraid if you remember them. You don't have to be afraid, because you can choose into a spirit of power, love, and self-discipline over a spirit of fear. And I think that's kind of what exactly where we're at too, is that we can choose. Like, we have a decision about what kind of spirit we can pray into and step into and engage with. And we don't have to take on a spirit of fear, because I think even here at FCBC, a lot of times we have a spirit of fear. I think we're afraid of a lot of things, afraid of change. I think we're afraid of losing people. I know I'm scared that what's going to happen to FCBC in 25 years, 50 years. Like, for one reason or another, a lot of us might not be here. And we're seeing some of that happen already, with people getting sick or passing. And that scares me, because a lot of times it feels like I have a scarcity mentality. Like, I need to hold on desperately to what we already have, because already that feels like a little bit. And so we try to keep everything going. We try to keep everything status quo, try to maintain all of our programs that we've ever had, because it gives some sort of veneer that there's life here. And there is, but I think a lot of times we would choose the programs over people because the programs make us feel like there's stuff going on. When actually what God is inviting us to is to consider, like, maybe some of these things need to be let go of for the sake of rest, or for the sake of joy, or for the sake of real connection. I don't know.